This triad exercise is the key to nailing the jazz sound in your solos, but like most players, I completely ignored it because it seemed stupid and boring. The thing is, it's the one exercise pro jazz players obsess over, and when I did too, it changed everything. So in this video, I'm gonna show you exactly how to use it to make your solos flow like real jazz, without years of frustration. Before I started using the triad exercise, my lines sounded like this. Nothing wrong, but way too predictable. Now here's a line that uses the exercise and suddenly you get those small jazz turns. Let me show you the exact exercise and how to practice it so that you can get that sound into your solos. My teacher gave me this exercise as homework and I thought, no way this is going to help my soloing. It's too easy. I completely ignored it, and that was a huge mistake because when you use it inside a line, it really does create those little jazz twists automatically. And as you will see in a bit, they are all over the solos from Joe Pass, Wes Montgomery and George Benson. Take a C major triad like this. It's simple. For each note in the triad, play a diatonic note above and a chromatic note below. So to keep it simple, let's just think of the triad in the C major scale. And if we take a chord tone like the fifth here, the G, then you have a diatonic note above, that's an A, and the chromatic note below will be an F sharp. And for the entire C major triad, you then have. You can also reverse the enclosure, something that will be very important later, as you will see when I show you how to create licks using this. At first you might think it sounds okay, but it's too predictable to use in a solo, which is exactly how I felt. And yes, you can hear pros play this exact lick. I came across it in solos of Barry Harris and Joe Pass, where it sounded like this, but that's not the real power of the exercise. To really understand why this exercise is so powerful, you need to know what actually makes jazz phrasing work. Most players think jazz phrasing is about adding chromatic notes or using weird scales, but that won't save bad phrasing. You can play a line with chromatic notes and it still won't sound like jazz. Like this. Can you hear how it feels kind of heavy and it doesn't really flow? But now check this out. Here's a similar idea but with a lot better flow and phrasing. Same chromatic flavor, but this one has life, and it's not because of the note choice, it's because of melodic direction and rhythm. The real secret is this: in jazz lines, direction creates rhythm, and here's what makes the first line feel heavy. In the first example, the melody keeps changing direction right on the downbeat. So the line sounds like it's sort of constantly landing on the heavy beats, and that really sort of kills any feel of swing and syncopation. In the second example, the melody flows through the downbeats and changes direction between the heavy beats, and that's what gives it that natural lift and makes the rhythm more syncopated, even if you're not trying to be fancy about it. And this is exactly where the boring triad exercise becomes gold. If you look at the good line, then you can already see pieces of the exercise inside. For example, right at the start, I have an enclosure around the F, the third of D minor 7. And notice that the enclosure is moving down, but the arpeggio that follows it moves up. So this is not on a heavy beat, and I think that one detail is really a huge part of the jazz sound. Now on the G7, I do a slightly different embellishment. Still the same concept, but I'm aiming for a target note on the C major 7, and the extra notes are really just there to create motion and direction to that resolution. And the line doesn't end on beat 1 of C major 7 when I hit that E. There is another enclosure that immediately pushes the whole thing forward and keeps the thing flowing. It sounds complicated, but really it's just two chord tones. It's the E and then the C, the root, and then I have the enclosure before the C. Here's the important point. The enclosures aren't just decoration, they shape the direction of the melody. And when the melody's direction is shaped well, the rhythm automatically feels more alive because you stop getting those predictable direction changes on the heavy beats. So on paper, this exercise can look like a boring little pattern, but the real skill is learning how to pull out small fragments and use them to create lines that actually sound like jazz. And that is the part most people are never told to learn. Because if all you do is practice the raw exercise up and down, it still won't be obvious how to turn it into music. A George Benson lick made this click for me, and I'm gonna break down that phrase and then I'll show you exactly how to practice it so that you can use it in your own solos. One lick from George Benson's solo on Billy's Bounce made me realize just how powerful this boring triad exercise really is and how I'd missed something essential. Now I was working on a simple 2-5 line, G minor to C7, and I couldn't stop thinking, why does this sound so good? That was this short fragment. And this is what I suddenly realized. If you take the line apart, the strong notes are basically just a G minor triad. So just a G minor triad in the second inversion. And the thing that makes it sound like jazz isn't that he's using some crazy scale, it is how he arrives at those basic chord tones using approach notes. So first you have a full enclosure, and then of course he also just uses a single approach note once in a while. Here we have the C sharp going to the D, and then another enclosure, a full one. And that is why it sounds so intentional, but also has a lot of energy and motion. It is a target and an approach note. Once that clicked, everything changed for me, because it meant that this wasn't just some random George Benson secret. It was a repeatable way to create that jazz flow on purpose. And after that, I started noticing it everywhere. For example, when I was transcribing Wes Montgomery on 4 and 6, now his lines aren't as dense as George Benson, but the concept is identical, and there are enclosures everywhere in this solo. And I even found it in a Joe Pass rhythm changes exercise that a teacher gave me. Same idea again. Triad target notes with little enclosures and approach notes, creating that forward motion. It was pretty mind-blowing. It wasn't just a trick that you throw in there on top, it was everywhere. And the best part is, you only need to know the triad. Coming up with lines gets way easier because you're not guessing. You always know what you're aiming for. So now let me show you how to practice this in a simple way, starting with the basic triad and then turning it into real lines that you can use in your solos. It is kind of ironic, but you can create really great bebop lines without thinking about scales at all, even though there are thousands of books on bebop scales. So here's how this works. Start with a simple triad melody. So here's a super plain C major triad idea. Now I'm going to add some enclosures, just going to the C on B3, so, and to the G, and then you have this line. And here's a tiny tweak that makes it feel more like jazz, because instead of always using complete enclosures, if you just take a single passing note, in this case I'm using the A to get to the G, then the phrase doesn't land so heavily on beat 1. Now here's the part that most people miss. The direction of the enclosure really does matter. Start with a tiny cell, 2 chord tones and an enclosure, so let's do E and C as the targets. Let's add an enclosure around the C. And this already sounds solid, but notice what happens if I flip the direction of the enclosure. Can you hear the difference? One direction kind of fights the natural flow of the melody, but in a good way. And that little clash is really what makes the line feel more alive. It really makes it pop. So anytime you can use an enclosure, you should instantly test it both ways. And sometimes, in fact mostly, it's going to be so that if the melody is moving one way and you can put the enclosure in the other way, that sounds better. Now here's the same small idea, but now connected to a C major 7 arpeggio and a short chromatic phrase. Now enclosures are one of the most powerful tools, but they're not the only one. Next I'm going to show you 2 more phrasing moves that will give you that same jazz flow without learning new scales or complicated theory. Once you start thinking in tiny 3 to 5 note building blocks, your soloing improves fast, because you're not trying to spell whole sentences in your solos. You're putting words together to say something. Now we've been using enclosures as one of those building blocks. Now I want to give you 2 more that instantly add energy to your 8th note lines without learning any new scales. So the first one is trills. A trill is just a quick burst that adds excitement without changing the harmony. And for guitar, using hammer-on pull-off like I did here usually sounds smoother and is a lot easier to execute. So start with those. Now watch how it works inside a real line. I'll combine a trill with a C major 7 arpeggio and a small enclosure. And you can also treat the arpeggio itself as the target and then add enclosures around the chord tones there. Here I'm adding a trill and have enclosures for the 3rd and the 5th of the C major 7 arpeggio. The next tool is chromatic triplets. Now this is one of those classic bebop sounds that you'll find in all the great solos. Now you might have heard Barry Harris talk about this as a part of his 5-4-3-2 system, but you don't really need the label, just steal the sound. Now I'll combine the triplet with a C major triad and an enclosure. Oh, here's the same triplet idea used to land on G, the 5th of C major 7, and then we add another enclosure to highlight the 3rd. And as a bonus, you also get that enclosure around the C at the end, which is, by the way, also a Charlie Parker favorite. Arpeggios are at the heart of jazz, and one arpeggio is a favorite of many great players like Barry Harris and Charlie Parker. You can use it on a lot of different chords and it sounds great everywhere, and that's what I cover in this video, showing you exactly where it works and how to turn it into great lines. Check it out, learn jazz, make music.